Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. What a blessing to be here together. I want to give a huge shout of thanks to David and Brian and Andrew for getting us up and going. We are going to begin, as we always do, with blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu ub'fi amcha beit Yisrael, v'niyeh anachnu v'tzetzaenu v'tzetzai amcha beit Yisrael, kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma, Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai notein ha'Torah. As I was thinking about this class, I was thinking, oh no, what are we going to do? No seltzer, no socks. How are we going to make this an engaging class? And then, all of the intensity unfolding in Israel. The rockets and the violence and the pain and the worry. Today, we are going to dive into liturgy as a way of sitting into what is, praying for what could be, finding the words that will help us to move through this chapter and to be as strong as we can be, the best allies for our beloved Israel as we can be. Liturgy in Jewish tradition used to be fluid and dynamic. Up until the medieval period, there were no printing presses, and so the amidot, the silent prayers that we offer, were created and crafted by chazanim, who would get up and would think about what was happening for their communities and share those thoughts and reflections and hopes in the words of an amidah. No one had the text in front of them. The prayer was with prayer that was said. With the invention of printing presses, liturgy became somewhat ossified. Suddenly there was a text, a prayer, a liturgy for every moment. And when that happened, we lost an ability to be dynamic, to be interpretive. We lost the ability for our prayers to be a conversation. But there are places in which some liturgy has remained fluid. When the state of Israel was founded in 1948, the two chief rabbis got together to rewrite the prayer for a country. There had been a practice of Jews of all time reciting a prayer for whatever country they found themselves in. For the emperor, for the pope, for the king, whoever was on top of them, please, 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 God, protect us. Help our ruler to be just, lawful, and understanding. So these two chief rabbis got together to write a prayer for the state of Israel. Now I want to set the stage a little bit. We often talk about the founding of our beloved Eretz Yisrael in 1948, but that moment was a total miracle in history. In 1948, Israel was mostly made up of immigrants who fled Eastern Europe, survivors of the Holocaust. It was almost 1 million people, 33% Jewish, 66% Arab Palestinians. And the Jews under the British were not allowed to have arms, were not allowed to be able to defend themselves. There were various groups working in secret to develop arms, to develop the ability to defend themselves, but it wasn't a given. And even though the world community thought it might be a good idea to divide Palestine into two nation states, a place for our Jewish homeland and a place for the Palestinians who were there already, the Arabs did not agree. And they began attacking the Jews. There were 4 stages of the war. Initially, it was a civil war. Initially, it was different groups within the Jewish community, Haganah and Etzel and Lehi, the Haganah was the underground military organization. There was a national military organization and the freedom fighters who were all fighting against Palestinians who were just waging violence on Jewish communities to try to push us out of the land, sending volunteers from November to March of 1948. It was just defense, trying to survive, trying to be there. And then April and May was the second period of this war. We took back major cities, the road to Jerusalem, took back territory in order to be able to protect ourselves. And then in May 14th of 1948, we declared our state, a state of Israel, home for the Jewish people. And at that point, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded. We managed to beat them back miraculously. Think about the survivors, without any real military equipment, without the time to prepare, without the infrastructure, we're able to push these forces back. And by the time we get to September, the war is mostly over. We're still fighting little skirmishes here and there, still taking back the road to the Negev and the Upper Galilee. But we've made it through a miracle, and now we're shifting our attention from fighting, from just trying to survive, to building. This is the place in which the prayer for Israel was first written. We're going to look now at this initial prayer for Israel. It was published in Hatzofeh in the newspaper in September of 1948. Michelle, would you read the prayer for Israel by Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Herzog?
Do you want it in English or in Hebrew?
Your preference.
All right. How about in English so everybody can hear, because we hear it in Hebrew a lot. Our Father in Shamayim, in heaven, rock, fortress, and redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, the initial sprouting of our redemption. Shield her beneath the wings of your loving kindness. Spread over her your sukkah of peace. Send your light and your truth to its leaders, officers, and counselors, and correct them with your good counsel. Strengthen the defenders of our holy land. Grant them and our Eloha salvation, and crown them with victory. Establish peace in the land and everlasting joy for its inhabitants. Remember our brethren, the whole house of Israel, in the lands of their dispersion. Speedily bring them to Zion, your city, to Jerusalem, your dwelling of your spoken name, as it is written in your Torah of your servant Moshe. Even as you are dispersed in the uttermost parts of the world, from there God your God will gather and fetch you. God your God will bring you into the land which your ancestors possessed, and you shall possess it. And God will make you more prosperous and more numerous than your ancestors. Unite our hearts to love and revere your name, and to observe all the precepts of your Torah. Speedily send us your righteous Moshiach for the house of David, to redeem those waiting for your salvation. Shine forth your glorious majesty over all the inhabitants of your world. Let everything that breathes proclaim, Adonai, God of Israel, is king, and their majesty reigns over all. Amen. Selah.
So I want to ask, it's 1948, you're living in Israel. This gets printed in the newspaper, and the chief rabbis are asking every Jew in Israel to recite this as part of the Torah service. How do you feel reading this prayer?
I would say hopeful. You know, it really is it's a prayer that the essence of it is to bring us together as a people, uniting us, and also the idea that that in 1948, after the war, it's still not 100% clear that Israel is going to be able to survive as a country. You know, we're just getting started. So there's some angst, there's some pathos, but there's also a lot of hope in this, in the writing of this tefillah. And and you mentioned the other day, I mean, the fact that that a prayer is printed in the newspaper. Israel is it's really a unique country, and always has been. And the idea that that prayer is essential to who we are as a people, even if you're a secular Jew. Part of that that sense of connection and prayer is there.
Yeah, that's definitely so fascinating about the context because, there's so much movement towards a secular society at the time. But I'll say, at the rally that CJP held, the virtual rally yesterday, I was incredibly inspired to hear a young high schooler start to chant the prayer for Israel, and he started in the way Elias so gorgeously starts our prayer for Israel each week. Avinu Shebashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo, and I was reading along and praying along, and every single word from memory. And then he reached this point that we get to on the second page, like, oh, we don't say that anymore, or at least we don't say that here in our shul, and I find it interesting which parts we have taken away, some of which in the conservative movement have to do with the Mashiach and our discomfort with Mashiach. But I'm wondering about, you asked about context, and you asked about original context, and I'm wondering that there is this beautiful third paragraph here about the gathering in of the exiles, and the sense that at the beginning of our nation, we need that. We need to be gathered into Israel. Today I just read Nancy Connors yesterday. Beautiful. I remember Nancy Connors, who's in Israel, wrote a beautiful letter to her family saying, basically, stop calling me and telling me to leave Israel. That sort of our orientation now as Jews in the diaspora is less about let us go and be gathered in to Israel, and more about what are you still doing in Israel, which I think is really troubling and problematic, and maybe we need to rethink bringing back this third paragraph.
And the other part of that too is also, as you mentioned, part of our discomfort with Mashiach, in the conservative movement, there's not a lot of talk of God, right? And this, the fourth paragraph here is, unite our hearts to love and revere your name and observe all the precepts of your Torah. So there's that, it's a very God-centered, which all tefillah really should be, but it is, and again, we don't do that much as a modern American conservative Jews, and I think that's a missing component. In the age of pandemic, I think people have begun to refine their sense of connection to something spiritual, to God. But this was clearly there then, and it's also clearly there in in parts of the Israeli society that are much more traditional and in their sense of the connection to the land, connection to Israel, connection to God.
I think there's also, in this last paragraph, the vision not only of connection to God, but that the other nations of the world will see the way that Israel unfolds and the way that Israel treats its citizens and the way that Israel treats world communities and who Israel is. And that will be a beacon. And people will say, who is that God? I want to follow that God. That Israel is going to be a beacon of light for the entire world. And there's part of me that wonders if part of why that fell away is also just that through the years we've gotten more jaded and more of the sense of like there are real challenges that face every nation in the world, and maybe that's not going to be what Israel can do. Maybe what Israel can do is just be a really good nation, and it would be enough to just be seen as a good nation and to not be held to the same critique, to a different level of critique as other nations in the world.
Well, but that's what's so fascinating about this prayer in that context, in that time. I mean, the entire aspiration of the Zionist dream, at least, is that Israel should be a normal nation, that we should have thieves and prostitutes and people who are engaged in all manner of, things that we would call a shanda for the goyim kinds of work, that actually show that we are normal, we are accepted, we are part of the population of the nations. And this exceptionalism, it would be interesting to be able to go back in history or to speak to anybody who was there at that time, sort of how was this heard? How was it accepted? Was it imposed down? Was it brought up? How did those who were kind of, out in the fields doing the hard work of rebuilding a nation receive this idea?
Right. And as you mentioned, also, of the 33% that were Jewish in Israel at that time, the percentage of people that were Holocaust survivors is huge, and how the fact that this kind of sense of prayer and connection to God, how did that fit into the life of many survivors who had probably in some ways stopped believing in God, even though they may have believed in the state of Israel in a homeland. So it's a very not a simple thing to say, and also your idea, like, was this imposed on the people, and what was the reality? Was this done in most places of worship at that time? It was a presentation. We should do this as opposed to do this.
Right. Well, clearly it was accepted because we still do it today.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it definitely had roots and wings here.
Mhm.
I'm really interested in a piece that is at the very bottom of the second paragraph of V'taknem be'etza tova. This idea that it's not just up to us to accept the guidance and leadership of our leaders, but also to invite God to help them to find the correct way and to correct them when they make mistakes, and to help them aspire towards walking on a good path. But sort of the assumption, Israel today, with any number of elections after election after election, certainly takes to heart this kind of guidance that's implicit in this prayer, which is that it's not just that you follow your leaders, whatever they say or whatever they do, but rather that we're always aspiring to a place where our leaders will hear the voice of wisdom, clarity, justice, and help guide us to the right place.
Yeah, and we're gonna continue moving along. We have so many prayers to look at today. I want to point out one key piece which I think is so beautiful. In 1948, there was no real sense of, there are 5 Arab nations attacking from the outside, and everyone's attacking from the inside. It was turmoil and stress and intensity, and within that, there's still, if you look at the top of page 2, Benatata Shalom Ba'aretz, establish peace in the land and everlasting joy for its inhabitants. And when Shai Agnon looks at that, he takes that out. He thinks, guard Israel, strengthen the position of the defenders of Israel, crown them with a wreath of victory. There's a really different vision of what is possible, and what we're gonna move towards. His is a more, I think, pragmatic understanding of what could be and how it could be. I want to move us now. We're gonna keep skipping ahead, because I want to take a look at a prayer that was written in 2002 in the midst of the second Intifada, and 2002 is right at the heart of that Intifada, and it's a very different kind of prayer, a prayer that's written in the sense of that we have a prayer for Israel, but it serves a very different function. Dan, I'm wondering if you can read. This is on page 5, source number 4.
Okay. Sure. My heart goes out to you, Zion. Tears, jubilation, celebration, grieving. Did we not dream a dream that came to be? And here it is, both song and lament. We are mere matter, and our prayer is to the Creator, toward the good and the just, direct the people seeking refuge in Zion. For all the world is yours, and we have but one land, which we inherited together with the sons and daughters of Hagar. Favor us with knowledge with which to understand the wisdom of Abraham. If you will go left, I will go right. Overflow with mercy on a great and troubled land. For Zion will be redeemed in judgment, and its inhabitants in righteousness.
So I just first want to ask, is this a prayer?
Yeah, I think it is. I personally think that all poetry is prayer. So that's a different thing. Yeah, but I mean, there's definitely it's a prayer for justice. It's a prayer for finding the road that will bring peace, which is the essence, I think, of the tefillah, the prayer for Israel. You know, if you go right, I will go left. Um, and also a prayer that all peoples will recognize God, but also all peoples will recognize the presence of God in looking at the person across from you and recognizing that every person is in the image of God.
Michelle, how does this strike you? Do you feel like this is a prayer?
I mean, it's a prayer. I studied with RA, so I take his words. They are a passion of his heart, and I think he's attempting to articulate something that's really critical for so many, which is this inherent complexity and challenge that this land is our land, and we lay claim to it, and yet we have cousins who lay claim to it as well. And how do we hold that? And he's attempting to strive to hold that. Um, I'm not sure. I would rephrase your question. Is it a prayer for the state of Israel? That would be more my question. And I think that can only be answered by the way in which it is adopted and accepted, and the way in which people feel it speaks to them or doesn't speak to them. I can tell you there's a lot for everybody in that first version. I noticed that Agnon took out Eretz Kodshenu, right, our holy land, the idea of our holy land, and sort of edited it and updated it, so that it continued to be a prayer that attempted to speak about Israel's defense, safety, security, prosperity from a Israeli perspective. And this one is a very universalist prayer that speaks to God about trying to find a way to rest in a land together with another people.
And this is also, but it goes back to the idea that Zion, that Israel is meant to be a beacon, and that the Jewish people are meant to be a beacon, and then held to a different standard, which is something we talked about a little bit earlier. Whether we want to, I think whether we want to or not, we will always be held to a different standard, and that's noted here. Zion will be redeemed in judgment, and its inhabitants in righteousness.
What is Aryeh Cohen's ideal outcome as he visions the ideal state of Israel, land of Israel? What's his vision that's articulated in this prayer?
It's like the lion and the lamb. It's just it. You know what I mean? It's just the idea that we will all respect each other and respect each other's right, not only to the land itself, but to peaceful existence. If we all recognize each other as essentially children of the same God, which is pointed out here, children of Hagar. If we do that, then the infighting, can stop in some way.
One of the things I find so interesting about this prayer, I would imagine if I were setting out to write a prayer about how we could coexist and how we could move forward, I think for me there would be something in there about figuring out how to process everything that has happened, how to process our history and the wrongs that have been done on both sides, and to really be able to sit down and move through that. And what's interesting to me with this verse, he's citing a place in Torah where Abraham and Lot are having a difficult time getting along, and they're both scrounging after the same resources, and the solution they come to is just to separate. Like, they don't actually figure out how to share resources. They don't actually figure out how to coexist. They just separate. And it's a very interesting vision for me. As long as I'm in a prayerful state, I think I want a prayer that's going to be bigger than just separating and having, like, you have yours, I'll have mine. I want a vision where we figure out a way to be able to share, because it feels like, and also I want to name that the context of this prayer is a place of deep pain and deep turbulence and deep loss. I mean, in the course of these 5 years, there are 4,000 some people who are lost to this violence. Like, it's tragic and intense and ripping things apart. And so I can understand why you would say just separate, but I want a prayer that's bigger than that.
Yeah, although I think he's calling on both the ancient wisdom of the Torah, that sometimes the biggest dream that you can dream is to separate peacefully, quietly. That would be the lesson of Abraham and Lot. And furthermore, I think that his prayer kind of lines up with Micha Goodman's argument that, perhaps we can't solve the conflict, we can only shrink the conflict, and perhaps in endeavoring to create a more limited prayer, he is endeavoring to try to give us some aspiration that perhaps, although not necessarily inspiring at all times, of course, the Mashiach coming and redeeming our land, and all of us being able to solve all of these things with one big giant. The Talmud has this great phrase, teku, which is like, eventually we're going to come and there'll be a solution. We don't have to solve it today, but somebody's going to come and fix this for us. And, those first prayers, which really tap into that energy, like somebody's going to come someday and there'll be peace. It's not within our hands to hold this. In some sense, Aryeh is forcing us, Rabbi Dr. Aryeh Cohen is forcing us to encounter the question of what would it look like if we believed that our prayers might possibly be met, like that they were in our hands to try to implement.
Yeah, I was thinking also, sometimes the best way to solve a conflict is to walk away. And that goes right back to the very beginning of the Torah. If Cain had walked away from Abel instead of being, it's part of the human condition in some way to fight with each other, and to learn to walk away and to avoid conflict is sometimes a reasonable way to
yeah, I mean, of course, the challenge of the state of Israel is that to say
that
the Jews should just walk away is an untenable perspective, right? The
Yes,
Abraham and Lot story works because Lot walks in the direction we want him to, which is not into our holy land, right?
But it also doesn't quite work because, like, fast forward, Abraham has to go save him. He runs into trouble. Like, their lives are intertwined, which is also an interesting part of the story, that you think you can separate. You think you can, find you have your land, I'll have my land, we'll all be. But biblical story is at least that vision has its own challenges, and ultimately we come back together, and there's something about being together that's life saving, which is hard to imagine in the current climate, and the tension that exists within this system. I want to move us ahead. We're gonna just glance at these, and we're gonna skip over this prayer from Rabbi David Seidenberg, which is a reflection on Rabbi Herzog's original prayer with a few small changes. One of the things it's so interesting is, as we move into periods of stability and calm, something that happens for us is we go back to traditional liturgy, and that traditional liturgy has both the meaning of the original context and of all the years that we've been saying since then. And so I think there's something really affirming that at 70 years, Rabbi David Seidenberg goes back and says, I want to change around some of the language. I want to make it more inclusive. I want to make it more egalitarian. But at its core, there's value to the traditional prayer that has been recited in Israel since the beginning of the state. I want to go now to our sixth source. This is a prayer for the state of Israel. It was written by a friend of mine, Rabbi Jordan Bronig, and posted on Facebook just this week. Michelle, would you be willing to read this?
By Rabbi Jordan Browning, it is possible to pray for peace. Our prayer life needs not know our boundaries. No green lines, no dashes, no subtle demarcations. Our longings can transcend our political ideologies, cut across our keen analyses. Earnestness, cast out of our public discourse, still has a place in the language of our hearts. We have the capacity to pray for the old couple crouched in the stairwell in Ashkelon and the terrified child in his pajamas in Gaza. We can spread our prayer like a tattered shawl, like a billowing canopy, like a sparkling firmament over the tired shoulders of these and across the narrow frames of those. We are not naive, not cowards, nor traitors to pray for peace. We are told to get in line, to stand with them, or to stand with the other, but we pray to a Holy One who resides in the space between, diminished by their missiles, laid low by their rockets, exhausted, but still listening for our prayers.
I want to ask that same question. Is this a prayer?
Well, and I'm going to give you the same answer. I think it's a prayer. I think it's actually a prayer for peace. And so it's in a different category. It's a prayer of his heart for the peace of Israel through the vision that he brings. I think the question is, what is the prayer for Israel, right? And at some level, there's at least for me, a prayer for Israel that would work would be a prayer that's wide enough and broad enough and big enough that anybody who loves Israel can say it. And that means by chance that some things are going to be excised from this side and some things are going to be excised from that side to sort of meet in a middle. A prayer for Israel is a prayer that all inhabitants can recite together. And that's actually a current challenge in Israel because there are Israeli Arabs who say, they want to also be part of a prayer for Israel. And what would that look like in a modern nation? But fundamentally, the concept of a prayer for a nation is, God willing, something that is broad enough to hold all who love that nation.
Dan, how does this strike you?
Yeah, I'm with Michelle on this. Yeah, it's a really interesting, question to ask. What really is a prayer for Israel? If you go back to that very first one that we looked at, it's really, it's Israel as the homeland for the Jewish people, and I still believe that Israel needs to be the homeland for the Jewish people, and so to pray for its, security and peace and prosperity, and Eitzah Tovah, all of that is really significant. And this particular prayer has that in it, but it also is, as you said, it's more a prayer of trying to find peace at the same time by again recognizing our shortcomings and our need to not be fearful in this moment of terror, and this is written really in a moment of terror, and so this is really heartfelt, and I really love your sense that the prayer for Israel needs to include everyone that lives there. But I was thinking about thing when you were just saying about that, and also thinking about, but also the complexity of what would a prayer for Israel look like to Hamas, for example, and Hezbollah, right?
Well,
they're
I did say a prayer for all those who love
Israel,
Israel.
not live there.
Correct.
Right. So maybe a prayer for Israel, for Hamas or Hezbollah is, this is our homeland. We need to live here too, and therefore we can't have Jews here. So it's a very complex thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think they
whereas-
wouldn't call it a prayer for
yeah.
Israel. I think they might use a different title for that,
Yes,
please.
exactly. Okay.
Yeah,
But I agree that this is I love this framing of it, because it also this framing of it brings in some really beautiful, you know, beautiful biblical and Jewish sources. We can spread our prayer like a shawl. You have the idea of a talid or a chuppah, a canopy, um, and you know, it just brings a lot of Jewish context to the prayer at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of a prayer for peace, right, insisting on the capacity to be able to pray for those who are terrified in stairwells in Ashkelon and stairwells in Gaza, right? And all the layers of complexity that brings because of the actions of those who claim to represent those people in Gaza, and the responsibility of those people who claim to represent. And nevertheless, a 7-year-old crouching in a stairwell is a 7-year-old crouching in a stairwell. That's a prayer for peace. That's a prayer for hope. That's a prayer for being able to hold complexity so that we can see each other as human beings. I think that the second piece, we are not naive, we are not cowards, is much more reactive and defensive, as it were. And for me, in my prayer for Israel, I would like to not see reactivity and defensiveness. I would like to see a prayer for the ability of the state of Israel to defend herself.
I also find something so interesting in this. We started off with a vision of God as having the capacity to protect, to guard, to bless, to empower, a petition to God to reinforce us to make possible more miracles after 1948. And in this, God crouching between the two peoples in the midst of, volleys of rocket fire and violence, diminished but still listening, is a very different articulation of God and God's capacity to be present with us. And for me, I think I love the invitation, the determination to open our hearts with compassion at the same time as we acknowledge realities on the ground, and at the same time as we work to create a structure that will actually enable us to live safely and securely and God willing in peace. But this vision of the Holy One, again, in my prayers, I want God to be more powerful than crouching between rockets. I want God to have a role in this, and I want to believe that there's, we have not been able to sort this for the entire history of the state of Israel, for the entire history of Israel for that matter. We haven't been able to find a way to live peacefully in the land. It's always been turbulent, always been challenged. And I would like to believe that there's a God somewhere that can help us to figure that out, so that thousands of years of conflict can be resolved, and we can say, we made it. This year in Jerusalem is a year of peace, and we figured out how to coexist together. And God is there with us. I want to wrap up by asking just one final question, which is, if you were designing a prayer for the state of Israel, however you define that state of Israel, for this moment, responding to the week that has been in Israel, responding to the history of our beloved Eretz Yisrael, the history of a Jewish people, which prayer would you choose? Would you choose one of the prayers that we've gone over today? Would you choose a prayer from the heart? Would you choose something else entirely? What would be your prayer for Israel? Dan?
Yeah, all of the above. And you knew I was going to say that, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a prayer that really needs to have, it needs to have the prayer for the heart of the moment, but also to be able to step away a little bit from the heart, from the heart of the moment. In other words, like not feel vengeful, not feel anger, not feel that God is crouching, not feel that we need to be crouching as a people, and the idea that we have to defend ourselves without being aggressors. All of that needs to be worked in. Personally feel that the God component is essential. And recognizing that Israel in the modern era is much more secular place, but the fact that God's presence of being able to be emotive without being too, as Michelle said, reactive, is all of that needs to be part of that prayer. We talked about music last week, and I think that if we think about all the different musical settings for these prayer, also, I think that really has an effect on how we feel the prayer as well.
100%.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go with the oldie and goodie. It speaks to me every Shabbat. It speaks to me now. The prayer to hold our people in a sukkah of peace speaks to me very, very deeply. The prayer to taknem, to be able to help us to see the right path, the right way, the path of compassion, the path of kindness, the path of justice that's laid out in our Torah. And chazek et yedei meginei eretz kodshenu. I pray that those soldiers who are rolling out, risking their lives today, will be protected, and that we will be able to see, God willing, something, some way. Whether it's a literal Mashiach or the messianic spirit that will help us to find our way towards peace, this first prayer works for me.
Me too. I love learning about liturgy. There's also this part of me, and I love the idea of a liturgical tradition that can be dynamic and flexible and fluid, and that you could come into the sanctuary and just open your heart and just share the words from your heart in that moment. I totally love that. And I love traditional liturgy, and I love words that everybody knows and everybody can sing along to. And that moment where we all get to swell together with our voices, we're going to have that soon, where we all get to be in the same room, singing the same song in the same moment with the same prayers. And I just want to invite everyone today, especially all days, but especially today. We're going to continue with our prayers for Israel in our Shabbat morning services. I want to invite you to sing along with the prayers for Israel, the prayer for Israel written by Jeremiah, this incredibly beautiful rendition. And I also want to invite you to take some time before, during, and after to offer your own personal prayers, the words from your heart. And we all pray that on the wings of our prayer, on the wings of the bravery of our soldiers, the courage of those in Israel who are working hard for peace, that there will be a ceasefire, there will be a resolution, and we will be able to chart a path forward in which we can coexist together. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.